And in reality, we're sort of told these kind of tropes, which is that fiber is essential for a healthy gut. Fat in general, animal products are bad, particularly if we're talking about risk of colorectal cancer and things like that. You then sort of dig into the literature. The evidence for that isn't great, and it focuses on just very specific populations. So like mice in general eat a high carbohydrate diet, and the strain of mouse in which the vast majority of all biomedical research is done, it's called the Black Six, has been bred over time to respond negatively to a high-fat diet. If you required a significant amount of fiber to always have a healthy gut, right? Just think about humans as they evolved. We had to be really good at dealing with a wide range of food sources and sometimes not having any food at all. So if you want your gut to remain healthy in the absence of food, it has to be able to survive on something else, and that is going to be ketones from the peripheral circulation. When humans migrated up into Northern Europe, there just aren't very many starchy carbohydrates in Northern Europe in the middle of winter, yet our guts functioned just fine.
Yeah, so let's just get right into it. I'm very excited to have you on, by the way. I've seen you in Dr. Paul Saladino's podcast several times, and Dr. Chatterjee's podcast. So very excited to talk to you today. I think I really want to focus on the recent paper that you just did. Congratulations on that, by the way. It was a pretty amazing study to read through that. But first, I want to touch on athletic performance in athletes, because I know that you do quite a bit of work with athletes. And it fascinates me because I was an athlete for over 10 years. And the common misconception always is that the fitter you look, the more healthy that you are. And, I've been on that side of the spectrum where I totally overtrained. I couldn't sleep, indigestion all the time. I couldn't ever eat enough calories because my stomach hurt all the time. So what are your thoughts about that and what you've seen?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's an interesting dilemma as well, because as a society we don't move nearly enough. I think that really contributes to a lot of the chronic disease that we see. However, what we think is required, for exercise to be useful or beneficial is training for marathons. These huge loads, like it's not a workout if you don't go out and run really hard for an hour. And that's also just really not true. Like the amount of exercise that you need to be healthy is probably less than you think, but you do still need to do it. But those that do then engage in exercise, particularly those who are amateurs, and I was an amateur athlete in multiple sports for long periods of time, and because this isn't your job, and you're not taking rest and recovery and maybe not nutrition seriously, and you're also thinking that you need to do more and more and more and more to be better and better and better, then that really does potentially lead you down a path of multiple health problems. So gut problems are very common. Being in a significant caloric deficit, for long periods of time, and we know it messes with. So in women, it messes with cycles, bone health, mental health. Now we are sort of an increasing appreciation that you see the same thing in men. It's called a relative energy deficiency of sport, or REDS, or RED-S, depending on who's saying it. And this causes a significant number of problems. So I think then when you also sort of look at some of the more elite athletes, the pointy end of the professional sports spear, we know that, so one of my favorite phrases, which I've stolen from somewhere else, but I'm afraid I can't remember where I got it from, which is that athletes, some elite professional athletes, they're very fit, right? They're incredibly fit for their chosen sport, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily healthy, right? Health being sort of the absence of gut problems, or other chronic diseases, and or hopefully living to be a long a long and healthy life.
Right.
Those two things are not necessarily synonymous, and sometimes that's fine. You really have to get yourself into a very specific corner of performance to be the best in the world at a given sport. But you also have to appreciate that there are maybe some trade-offs there, right? That
Yeah.
sort of longer term, right? If you're a professional endurance athlete, you may end up with less muscle mass than maybe you would want for long-term health.
Right.
And then and maybe there are other things that are going on, particularly in terms of gut health, like you mentioned, or other aspects of physiology, and that's fine. So you make that sacrifice for that period of time. If this is paying the bills, it's incredibly important. But then maybe you need to appreciate a shift in your training or your lifestyle afterwards in order to recover some of those aspects of health. So it's never like a sort of a cut and dried thing, right? At any given
Right.
time, you have to decide what's most important to you. And so sometimes, even when it's not necessarily going to be healthy, you may need to drop more body weight or increase your training volume, or change how you eat, sleep, and recover. Or maybe there's the travel aspect, which can often really mess with athletes' health as well. But it's a necessary part of the sport. So you take that into consideration, but then equally you try and balance that longer term. So often, I work with athletes who want to be perform sort of a master's level, or just be able to show up for the start line for decades to
Right.
come. And then you have to take a slightly different approach, and you may sacrifice short-term performance for long-term health, and that's
Yeah.
fine too. So in reality, you just need to appreciate that there are trade-offs in all of these things, and there's no one right answer, but there is certainly some potential risk with taking a training and a nutritional approach that is used by elite athletes and then applying that to the general population, and that's where you often seem to see problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What are the common hindrances that, you see? We talked a little bit about like gut health and sleep, but what are some of the other ones that you see?
Well, in reality, um, you want to be able to do the amount of exercise or training, particularly if it's sport specific, that you can then recover from, right? Sort of
Mhm.
the adage is that you don't get fitter or stronger during the training, right? You do that during recovery as the body adapts to the load that you put on it. So then, I mean, the biggest factors that come into play are total caloric balance and intake, and that does sometimes intersect with gut health, because you'll often see if you're in a energy deficit, or for various other reasons, because of the effect of exercise on the gut, particularly very high volumes and intensities can um, damage the gut, for want of a better word, particularly in the short term, which then makes it harder to digest. You can get digestive symptoms. So just getting in enough calories is one of the most important things, and determining the caloric needs of an athlete, particularly an athlete that has quite a lot of muscle mass, is really hard. And most of the equations that we have to guesstimate how many calories you need really don't work
Really?
in that population. So you have to do a lot of trial and error, and also a lot of measurement and tracking over time in that population. So calories important, sleep obviously incredibly important. Although I think we're now getting to a point where we've kind of gone the other way, and we're just so keen to pathologize sleep. We want to track it. We want to get
Mm,
all the different sleep stages, and if we don't get it, then we're going to worry about it. And I think what you see when you work with the elite athletes is often they don't want to know, because they know, they appreciate that sometimes the information can negatively affect them mentally, which then affects their performance. So as a coach, you may want to gather that data and look at it, and see if you can tweak some stuff, and I think that's beneficial. But sometimes the athlete themselves shouldn't, or doesn't want to know, because it can affect their mental performance. So that's important too. So sleep
right.
and nutrition are incredibly important, but then a lot of other stuff does come into play. So if you think about something we might call total allostatic load, which is just like, what's the total load of all the stresses that you're putting on your body? So sleep and caloric deficits and total training volume are incredibly important. So like making sure that the volume of the training program is appropriate for the athlete and tracking responses to that. But then, you know, other stresses come into play, right? Everybody has a, you know, maybe you have another job, right? If you're not a professional athlete, you know, you have a family, you have other commitments. I've certainly seen many amateur ultra endurance athletes who really sacrifice a lot of you know, the benefits of home life because of the amount of training and traveling that they're doing. And you can do that if you have agreement from your family in the short term, but long term, that's definitely going to cause strain, which in itself is its own stressor. So,
Yeah.
you know, committing yourself to a sport in a way like that can be really difficult from like the family and another standpoint as well. And for some athletes, that becomes a significant stressor too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you touched on something really interesting, which is, um, being perfectionistic about sleep can in itself inhibit good sleep. And I've definitely noticed that in myself with like diet, near like orthorexia type levels, in myself at times where I'm like, if I don't eat the perfect thing, then it's like, oh, it's all gone to shit,
Yeah.
And it's like, that's totally not the case, right?
Yeah, and I was absolutely the same, 15, 16 years ago, something like that. And it takes a while to sort of get out of that mindset, sort of being continuously obsessed with the quality or the amount of food that's going in your mouth, which like I said, has its own negative effect. So to kind of tie that into another area where we're seeing a huge amount of tracking, which is potentially beneficial, but then also detrimental for certain types of individuals, is glucose monitoring.
Right.
And so continuous glucose monitors are super sort of common and in, say, the biohacking or other sort of cutting edge arenas of health. But we know that expectation about a meal will affect blood sugar levels. So there's been studies that where they gave participants the same drink twice, and they also gave them the nutrition label. And one said this is a low carb drink, and the other one said this is a high carb drink. It's the same drink. After participants drank the high carb drink, they got a bigger spike in blood sugar because they were expecting there to be more carbohydrate in that drink. So if you have a continuous blood sugar monitor and you eat something that has a large amount of carbohydrate, you're going to think, hey, there's a lot of carbs in here. This is going to make my blood sugar spike. And it will, but not necessarily because of the carbohydrates in the meal. And so this continuous stressing about these things. And so if you and then you also see, people who are proponents of continuous glucose monitors will be like posting on Instagram about, oh, I'm going to eat this cookie and, oh, isn't it terrible, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then that stress is going to cause a spike in blood sugar, like regardless of whether like what the carbs in the cookie are. So like this hyper focus, like what we think is going to happen directly affects our physiology in measurable ways. And the same thing happens with sleep. Like regardless of how somebody slept, you can randomize them to be told that they slept well or they didn't sleep well. And those who are told that they didn't sleep well will perform cognitively worse because they think they didn't sleep well, regardless of how they actually slept. And so there's all this stuff that comes out of the psychology literature that tells you that sometimes this sort of hyper focus on these details is going to cause problems in itself, regardless of what's actually happening to the thing that you're measuring.
Oh man, yeah, this is part of the reason. Well, in addition to like the cost, right, of getting like an Oura ring or getting a continuous blood glucose monitor, but this has been part of the reason why I don't want to get it, because I know if I'm already kind of orthorexic, it'll make it'll make it worse, or it has the potential to.
And again, the problem is that I think the majority of people who are interested in this stuff, like you are, like I am, will have a tendency to become hyper focused and obsessed in that way. So it's kind of like a self-reinforcing problem, just because the people who might benefit from a continuous glucose monitor, so say somebody who knows nothing about their blood sugar or their metabolic health,
Right.
and you're trying to get them to understand the effect of food on their physiology, because maybe that will help them, adjust the quality of their diet slightly. You put a continuous glucose monitor on them for 2 weeks. They track their food. They say, oh, hey, when I have rice, I get this big spike. So maybe I should switch to a different, starch source or carbohydrate source, or a
Right.
non-starchy vegetable or some more protein or something like that. I think that's really useful in that population. I don't think it's that useful in somebody like you or I because of those same issues.
Right. No, absolutely. The placebo effect is important. I think that's sometimes overlooked.
Yeah, no, and no SIBO in this, right? So
Right.
it's
Right.
the negative side of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. I want to shift gears and talk about your the recent paper that you published called "Reframing Nutritional Microbiota Studies to Reflect an Inherent Metabolic Flexibility of the Human Gut: A Narrative Review Focusing on High-Fat Diets." So, tell me a little bit about the background of the study and what questions you hope to address.
Yeah. So this is a really fun kind of side project. It's not really any part of my normal academic work, but the one of the authors, Lucy Mailing, she has a PhD in the gut microbiota, essentially, and she is my like go-to person on anything and everything gut related. So if you have gut health struggles, go and check out her blog. You know, maybe you want to consult with her. Just anybody who's listening, she's fabulous. But so she, and so as well as being actively involved in coaching and previously having done some research, she does a lot of sort of synthesizing the gut microbiota research for practitioners, functional medicines, physicians, um, and when you do that, it's very useful. You can write it in an accessible way. It goes on a blog post. It's free to access. People can actively use it. However, at the same time, I think it's also important to put that stuff into the academic literature, because there are going to be other groups of people who don't necessarily appreciate what's being done sort of on the ground.
Right.
And so I, when she puts together some of this stuff, I encourage her, hey, let's well, for this scenario, I encouraged her and say, hey, let's turn this into a paper, a formal paper. And so a lot of most of the research that's in there is based on work that she's done. And then at the same time, she was contacted by a guy called Jonathan Scholl, who's a philosopher of science, and particularly interested in the philosophy of nutrition. And actually, he said something similar to Lucy. He was like, "Hey, Lucy, you do all this great work. Let's turn it into a paper." So, like, the three of us kind of then collaborated in that process. And Jonathan did most of the bulk of the writing of the paper itself in the first instance. And the idea really was to get a more holistic view of what contributes to gut health from a nutritional standpoint and what we do and don't know. Um, and in reality, we're sort of told these kind of tropes, which is that fiber is essential for a healthy gut. Fat in general, animal products are bad, particularly if we're talking about risk of colorectal cancer and things like that. And when you then sort of dig into the literature, you see that the evidence for that isn't great, and it focuses on just very specific populations. So like mice in general eat um, a high carbohydrate diet, and the strain of mouse in which the vast majority of all biomedical research is done, it's called the black six, has been sort of bred over time to respond negatively to a high fat diet. And so then this is the context that we do a lot of work. We put these mice that are bred to become fairly unhealthy on a high fat diet, get obese, and have all these other health issues. And then we put them on a high fat diet, and then we say this is good or bad for the gut, and then we try and extrapolate that to humans.
Why is that they were bred to do poorly on a high fat diet?
Because this is, when you're trying to understand the effects of diet on health,
Mm-hmm.
we have a rough idea. So the first problem, and I think it's the first problem we address in the paper, is what is a high fat diet? Like, what does that even mean? Right. So for a mouse, a high fat diet is lard, soybean oil, and sucrose, sugar, and protein, usually from casein, which is milk protein. And so basically, it's like cheesecake and Coke. Right. That's the high fat. That's the high fat diet. And so just then saying, right, so this diet is high in fat and it's bad because it's high in fat. Well, that's not really true, because there's a lot of other aspects. There's a huge amount of sugar that's coming along with that, in particular.
Right.
But it does approximate fairly well an ultra processed, highly refined Western diet, right? It does look like that. So when you're trying to see, how do humans nowadays eat, which we know is negatively affects our health. This is what it looks like. And then we want to have mice who respond in the way that we expect, humans to, kind of. They become obese and get type 2 diabetes and all these things. And so that kind of underlies why that research environment exists.
Got it.
However, the problem then becomes when we extrapolate that out further, right? So calling the cheesecake diet a high fat diet, then automatically we think, well, then anything else that's high in fat must automatically be bad. And we do the same thing when we look at human nutrition. And that's much trickier because in general, humans don't remember what they eat. But when you ask them what they eat and then try and look at health aspects, it becomes really difficult because the quality of the data is poor.
Right.
But we do the same thing. So we kind of like lump all this stuff together. So we might say, well, those who eat a human high fat diet, they're people who eat pastries and cakes and cookies and red meat and high fat dairy or something. And so like, there are so many different things in there. So to kind of lump them together isn't really fair, because you're essentially saying that pastries and cookies have the same effect on health as red meat. And we know that like just physically isn't going to be the case, but that's how we lump them together in studies. So really, it's exactly the same problem. Like we're kind of taking all these different aspects of diet, some of which may be good, some of which may be bad, some of which may be neutral, kind of lumping them together and then expecting, that they all have the same effect on health. So the high fat diet
Right.
in a mouse definitely, reflects, cheesecake with a side of Coke, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean that if I say go on a ketogenic diet, which has some fatty red meat, lots of non-starchy vegetables, that is the same thing. Whereas in the research, they'd say that's the same thing, but in reality, it really isn't.
Interesting. So you mentioned a few problems. One is that the mice, generally, their natural diet is a high carbohydrate diet, and then they're
Yes.
also bred to do poorly on a high fat diet. And also, the way that a high fat diet is defined is soybean oil, lard, refined sugar. And so it's really a problem of, oh, and the questionnaires, right? That can yield some poor studies, like the healthy user bias. So it seems like there are so many confounding factors that we can't really say for certain which causes which. This show is brought to you by the Biooptimizers. Now, specifically, I want to talk about their magnesium breakthrough formulation, because this isn't any old magnesium. This is actually a very unique form. Now, I've tested virtually every form of magnesium, from glycinate and oxide to magnesium L-threonate and citrate. So I know which ones have worked and which ones have been nothing more than an expensive laxative. And I can say without a doubt that the magnesium this company has is actually, as the name suggests, a breakthrough for magnesium. So I'm going to tell you why it's so important for the body. First, it works as a sort of anti-anxiolytic, which means that there's research which shows that it can help promote calm in the face of mental and emotional stress. There's actually an inverse relationship between the amount of stress that you have and the amount of magnesium in the body. In other words, the higher the stress, the less magnesium is found in the body. Now, it's also been found to have pretty remarkable effects on metabolic health. It's been shown to improve some blood markers like insulin, blood sugar, and even high blood pressure. And the problem is it's highly depleted from soils because of modern agricultural methods and pesticide use. And we're probably eating way more processed food than we usually do, and processed food, by definition, is refined and is missing some of those micronutrients. And finally, this form has all 7 forms of supplemental magnesium. And it's important because different forms actually do different things in the body and can get absorbed better in different parts. So, since you've been listening to this podcast, Biooptimizers is offering 10% off using the link. It's in the description. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the first part of the paper is really saying that, hey, to even understand the problem, we need to be much better at the language that we use and at separating out different parts of the diet. So when it comes to human studies, don't put cookies and steaks in the same group, because
Right.
they are not going to have the same things on health. And so that means that we don't even necessarily have the starting point that we want in order to answer these questions, right? So
Right.
kind of, if we're doing that, then we have to discount a lot of the research that's been done already, and then also changing the language. Like, your high fat mouse diet should actually be a highly refined, high fat, high sugar diet, right? That's more
Right.
accurate, right? So even just changing our language, becoming more precise, is important. And then sort of later on, um, in the paper, one of the things that we cover is the fact that is that idea about fiber and short chain fatty acids being critical for normal gut function. And so, the story is that you eat lots of fiber, bacteria in the gut turn it into short chain fatty acids like butyrate. Butyrate is then used as a fuel source by the epithelial cells in the gut. And that is true. That does happen, right? That we're not saying that's not true. However, in some scenarios, say if you have a lot of inflammation in the gut, your gut epithelial cells become less good at taking up butyrate from the gut, right? So then it's kind of, you almost have this self-propelling problem, because even if the butyrate is there, they can't use it. At the same time, you see that actually there are a number of different things that could be used by those same cells as well as butyrate. So if you there's so we cite a study where they put people on either a low fat plant-based diet or a higher fat animal-based diet. And when you go on the higher fat, low carbohydrate animal-based diet, you see a shift in what's produced. So you don't get these normal short chain fatty acids, you get these iso short chain fatty acids like isobutyrate. But that can have the same effect, or can actually be more potent in terms of activating some of the beneficial pathways in the gut. And we also know that gut cells can use circulating ketones, not from inside the gut, but from the blood, from the peripheral circulation. So if you're on a ketogenic diet making ketones, your gut cells can then use that instead of the butyrate that you might get from the gut. And then finally, there's also some evidence that they can use acyl carnitines, which is basically a certain amount of fatty acid attached to an acyl group. So they can actually directly use some fats as well for energy. So, like, this is basically all going, lots of biochemistry to say that what we're told that the gut needs is just much more complex than that. And
Right.
it makes perfect sense, because if you required a significant amount of fiber to always have a healthy gut, right? Just think about humans as they evolved. We had to be really good at dealing with a wide range of food sources, and sometimes not having any food at all. So if you want your gut to remain healthy in the absence of food, it has to be able to survive on something else, and that is going to be ketones from the peripheral circulation. Or when humans migrated up into northern Europe, right? There just aren't very many starchy carbohydrates in northern Europe in the middle of winter. Yet our guts functioned just fine. And so it's just trying to say that there are multiple different pathways through which the gut can be healthy, multiple things that the gut can metabolize. And that suggests that the gut is inherently what we call metabolically flexible. So
Right.
depending on what you have available, your gut should be able to shift its metabolism to be able to retain some kind of overall semblance of health and good function. And then also adapt, right? With seasons, you can go from having only meat or animal based foods in the winter. Again, so we're thinking about northern Europe, and I do that just because that's where we see really big shifts in the foods that are available. Doesn't Or could be any sort of more northern part of the northern hemisphere. It could be or southern part of the southern hemisphere, right? Goes in both directions.
Mm-hmm.
And we see big shifts across a season. Like, so there may be lots of berries and fruit in the summer, but that isn't there in the winter. So we have to be able to adapt. And that is one of the reasons
Right.
why humans took over the world as we did, is because we are hugely adaptable. So I think that the main problem, again, just stems from the fact that we've got this very narrow view of what's required for gut function, and then anything that deviates from that we think is pathological. But that, to me, that doesn't make any sense, because as humans we have to be able to deal and be healthy in a much wider range of food environments, and that's obviously what we see during human evolution. So then we can't we can't discount that when we're then looking at gut health and what might be required for that.
Right. No, absolutely. And there's actually, I think it was a relatively recent paper by Dr. Bendor, which I think actually Dr. Saladino interviewed him,
Hmm.
and it suggested that we evolved for a pretty large part of our evolutionary history as kind of specific or specialized omnivores, where we mostly ate a lot of meat.
Mm.
And yeah, I think that's so important. Like, we are so adaptable. That is literally what makes us human, I think, our ability to adapt to different fuel substrates. So do you think that maybe saying like fiber is good, like just that as a blanket statement, is flawed?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be, really,
Yeah.
because that doesn't mean it's bad, right? But
Right.
it just, like, saying that it's universally good and universally essential, like, we have evidence that just isn't true. And that doesn't mean that I'm not a fan of fiber. Like, I
Right.
think most people should eat vegetables, but
Hmm.
right, there are scenarios where taking them out of the diet has dramatic effects on health, and we have to include that in our model. Sort of like a mental
Right.
model about what contributes to health. And it's interesting because I think that so yeah, there's Mickey Bendor's paper, and then afterwards there was a paper that came out talking, which said, well, actually, starch was a really important part of human evolution and brain development, and we've gone back and forth, right? And some people are saying meat or seafood is critical to brain development. Other people were saying that starch is critical to brain development. We definitely know that cooking was an important development, because that increases the bioavailability of the macronutrients and micronutrients within the food, and that's the case for both animal and plant-based foods.
Right.
But and so then I just saw a nice comment from Mickey, which said, hey, we never said that starch wasn't an important source of food, right? Humans have eaten starch, right? Just because you say that animal products are important for our evolution doesn't mean that other sources aren't. And so everybody wants to create what I call these false dichotomies, right? It's either this or it's this. We're like,
Yes.
hey, what about it being both? Because if we go back to the environments that humans have thrived in, the foods and the macronutrients and all the other things that contribute are hugely different. So then assuming that each of us requires exactly the same food or other environment just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of crazy that there's so much black and white thinking, even amongst highly educated scientists, researchers, doctors. Like, I know there's, people like Dr. Michael Greger, Dean Ornish, Dr. Esselstyn, and they there's also people on the other side of the spectrum, I think, too, right? Like,
Mhm.
where ketogenic diet is the only solution, or low carb diet is the only solution. And I guess my question is, why do you think that that occurs even in people who are very, very educated?
So, I mean, there's a number of potential reasons. A lot of it stems um, from the way that we make decisions, and then the importance of a tribe and the requirement of an enemy for us to come together, right? So the way humans make decisions is that um, we make a decision based on emotion, and then we try and find evidence to support the decision that we've already made. So
Right.
Michael Grieger talks about his grandmother who had lots of chronic diseases, went on a plant-based diet, dramatically improved her health, lived to a long, healthy age. I can't remember how old. This creates this storyline that this is the important thing, right?
Mm.
And then you find all the evidence that supports that. And then I also believe that with his patients, he sees significant improvements in their health, right? If you go on a low-fat plant-based diet, for most people, that dramatically improves the quality of their diet, and they're probably going to do a whole host of other things that support their health as well. So I am not discounting that. Whole food plant-based diets that of high quality foods, absolutely on a list of potentially beneficial, tools in your dietary toolbox. At the same time, right, if that's the storyline, then you gather a tribe of like-minded people around you, and then you have to have something to work against. Like dietary fat is going to raise your cholesterol and cause heart disease, right? That
Right,
just comes
right,
up
right.
again and again and again and again. um but then like you said, it goes the other way. So like we certainly have keto protagonists who are like, carbohydrates are addictive and they cause type 2 diabetes, and as long as you take them out, you can have as much fat as you like, and the quality of your diet doesn't matter as long as there's no carbs in it. And again,
Yeah,
I have physically seen that dramatically improve people's health. But to then say, well, fiber is bad for you, and plants are trying to kill you, and carbs cause diabetes, that is demonstrably not true in the majority of cases. So
right,
again, it just comes back to I think our desire. Well, so we see something working, it works for us, it works for somebody else, it works for our patients, then it becomes a very that's very compelling. And then you find reasons to support that, and then to continue to justify it, you have to find flaws in the alternatives.
right.
And then that's part of creating a tribe, which is, we're social beings. It's very important to us. However, when like I have worked with people, and I've seen people thrive and fail at every different part of that spectrum. So I can't pick a side, because there isn't a side for me to pick, because
Right.
I've seen it all work and I've seen it all fail, and I think that's the answer. But it's a much harder story to tell.
Yeah, I mean, so what I'm hearing, and what I've really also seen too in myself and friends and family members, is that it's bioindividuality is the name of the game, I
Mm.
think. And when we try to say plant-based diet is the human, species appropriate diet, or when we say carnivore diet is species appropriate diet, I think it goes back to the fact that we're highly adaptable
Yeah,
species.
and I guess the problem is that we don't currently have a good way of saying, hey, for you, this is what a good diet is going to be, your species, or like, then we have to get
Right.
like, right, it's no longer species, we have to get like into what in an animal you'd call a strain or something, right? And this gets really, really problematic when we try and figure that
Yes.
out. But you might have some idea, right? So we know, you know important to cover here right now, like race is a social construct, right? And it's not real, it's not biological, it doesn't determine genetic susceptibility or preference to any given diet, and or any given
Right.
disease or anything like that. But you could think about, right, so my most recent ancestors in the last 1,000 years, right, and within races, those could come from very different places in on the planet, which is
Mhm.
really important to take into consideration. But so you could think, for you as an individual, your most recent ancestors, what environment did they, you know, exist in, and
Right.
what environment had their ancestors evolved in. And so for me, it's a fairly easy thing to do, because most of my ancestors spent a long time in Northern Europe, right? Just like I mentioned, I use myself as an example because it's an easy example to give, right? And so then significant amounts of starchy carbohydrates, probably not something that my ancestors were exposed to a lot of. And so
Right.
maybe I would do better on a lower carbohydrate, higher protein diet. And in general, I have seen that. But if your ancestors lived close to the equator, right, more starchy carbohydrates, more sugar available more of the year round, and so maybe you do better on a diet like that. Um, then, of course, as our world population has increasingly intermingled, which is a fabulous thing, that becomes really hard, because what if you had
Right.
your ancestors who were in Northern Europe and in Costa Rica, right on the
Yeah.
equator? Then it becomes really difficult, and I don't have a good
Yes.
answer for you. And you're going to have to do a little bit of a self experimentation.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I was going to ask you that at the end, but I guess, like, what do you think we can do other than, self-experimentation, I guess, is obviously an important part of it, but are there like certain testing methods that you prefer in order to try to, tease that out?
Uh, Not really. So, well, I mean, if we're talking testing in terms of like blood tests, maybe some blood sugar monitoring, how do you respond to certain foods? I mentioned that I think for some people that is useful.
Right.
And one thing that we do know about blood sugar in particular, just because it's the one that's been researched the most, is that for two given individuals, they will respond to the same food very differently from a blood sugar standpoint. And multiple different things come into that: their current gut microbiota, the context of the meal, right? Is it breakfast? Is it lunch? Have you exercised? How did you sleep? There's a genetic component that we don't fully understand yet, but it does seem to affect things. What's your overall metabolic health and blood sugar regulation like that seems to really change how you respond to a given carbohydrate. So all of that's important, but the problem is that for an individual, you probably don't have all of that data. So some blood sugar monitoring is probably a good start, as well as just like some basic blood tests. Like you can get a comprehensive metabolic panel. You can do a complete blood count. You can do some basic lipid, tests, cholesterol and that kind of stuff. Blood sugar metrics like fasting glucose, HbA1c, and that probably gives you an idea of your overall health, and then says, well, what you're currently eating, is that kind of supporting that, and then maybe you can change something, and you can retest those things, and all those things are pretty easy and cheap to get. If I was going to take somebody who I knew nothing about and wanted to try and predict what diet they're going to do best on, right now I think that is physically completely impossible.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, that's fascinating stuff. And I actually recently interviewed someone who is very involved with nutrigenomics research. And that's, I mean, in its infancy, but I think once that gets more developed, that'll be pretty fascinating to be able to test your DNA and be able to help you out, at least in helping you aid to what diet you want.
Yeah, so it's like nutrigenomics is something that I believe will one day be useful. Right now, if you see a product on the market that says, hey, we can test your DNA on what diet and then tell you what diet you should eat, that is not true. Nobody can do that. So if they're telling you they can do that, they are lying, or they are misinterpreting or overinterpreting the available data. I think we may get there one day, but we cannot do that right now.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's exactly what he said. He said it can give you a general framework from which to start, but at the end of the day, it's what you just said. It's testing, experimenting, retesting, and then, trying to make shifts in diet and then retesting again. That seems to be the method.
I would personally argue that knowing the genetics doesn't help you at all,
Really?
because you're going to make changes based on the physical outcome, what I call the phenotype, like how your blood sugar responds, how your blood tests respond. And so knowing the genetics doesn't make any difference, because what you're going to make changes on are these other things. So I would argue that that's $300 you don't need to spend, and you can just do it the free way.
Okay, very interesting.
That's my personal opinion.
Yeah. I want to get back to your paper. So I recently had, well, not that recently, a couple months ago, Dr. Marvin Singh, who's a gut microbiome expert on the podcast, and he seemed to think that, the microbiome is so complex that it doesn't seem to be hackable with specific food substrates. And also in the paper, you mentioned that there is not really a well-established definition of what is considered a healthy gut microbiome. But this goes in contrary to actually someone, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. His name is Joel Green, and he actually is, I guess, becoming more well-known for protocols which aim to target specific gut microbiome or gut bacteria. So do you share Dr. Singh's viewpoint?
Yes, absolutely. And if you, in general, just like, so like we were just talking about nutrigenomics, if you go to an academic geneticist and you say, hey, based on this one SNP, I'm going to recommend that somebody eats this diet, they will laugh you out of the room. They know that is completely nonsensical. They'll say that, single SNPs cannot tell you anything about somebody's health or lifestyle or anything else, what they should do. And I think the microbiota research is in exactly the same place.
Okay.
If you went to, a true microbiota or microbiome researcher and you said, hey, I think if I can increase or decrease this bug, I'm going to have this effect on health, they will, they just will not take you seriously. They will laugh you out of the room, because for every attempt that you do to do that, there is a paper that says that the opposite will happen, right? So if we look at the ketogenic diet research on the gut microbiota, Um, there's one very well cited study, we included it in the paper, that said that so they took mouse models of epilepsy, they put those mice on a ketogenic diet, and they saw an increase in uh, uh, a bacteria called Akkermansia muciniphila, which is probably well known as being important for like degrading and maintaining the mucin layer of the gut. So they saw an increase of that with the ketogenic diet. And then when they actively gave that bug as like a probiotic, it had the same effect. So it had this reduction in seizures in these epilepsy models. However, in an autism model in the mouse, they put the mice on a ketogenic diet and they saw improvements again in sort of autism-like behaviors in these mice. But with that came a dramatic decrease in Akkermansia muciniphila, despite the fact that these were put on essentially the same ketogenic diet. And so when you look at which bugs go up and down in sort of animal studies on a given diet, say a ketogenic diet, there's a review paper that came out recently that basically said, we don't know. Like in some models, it's going to go up, and in some models, it's going to go down. And usually, you see a benefit regardless of the shift. And so, like for everything that we think, everything that we're told about the gut microbiota, there is an exact example that discounts it. So we think that alpha diversity, right, the diversity of the gut microbiota in general is better for health. But in some conditions, like Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune hyperthyroidism, those patients seem to have a dramatically increased diversity in the gut, which is associated with the disease. In some cases, we think there are some bugs that were beneficial. So like in athletes, we have a lot more Prevotella, which is part of like the adaptation to the gut, particularly in endurance athletes. But in rheumatoid arthritis patients, they also have more Prevotella, right? And that's associated with disease. So like if you think that you know how the gut is going to respond and whether that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, again, I don't think you fully understand the current scope of the research.
Wow. So basically, whether you have a different model, so if you have someone, or a mice model of autism versus a mice model of epilepsy and epileptic seizures, the composition of the microbiome, regardless of if they both show positive results, could be different.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God.
To the same diet.
Yeah.
And then we don't, right, then we're only just beginning to look at how these things happen in humans, right? So like
Right.
you're first of all, you're extrapolating a huge amount of rodent data to humans, which is not necessarily the best thing to do. And I say that, right, I am a professional rodent researcher, right? This is what I do in my day job, and I will tell you that rodents are not mini humans for the vast majority of stuff that we use them to research. So that, first of all, that's a big problem. And then, when we're looking at how the gut microbiota shifts in the human in response to something, we're only just starting to do that, right? Clinical trials where we do something and then we test the gut microbiota. And then the question is, are we even looking at the right thing? So most microbiota sequencing uses something called 16S amplicon sequencing. And that gives you an idea of the species, maybe a rough idea, probably more just like the genus of like the broad groups of the bacteria, whereas you need to do like shotgun sequencing plus metabolomics plus transcriptomics to understand not only what are the species, the exact species, and maybe even the strains of the different species of the bugs, which is a level of detail that we don't have, but you also need to know what are they actually doing, because
Right.
what's much more important than the bug itself is what it's physically doing. So you could have different bugs in widely different species or in different genuses that are having the same physiological effect, right? They're producing the same metabolites, or they're supporting gut function in the same way. So you really need to be looking at function of the bacteria rather than just like what bacteria are there. And we don't have that level of detail in the vast majority of studies. So again, doing 16S amplicon sequencing on a patient after they go on a specific diet and thinking that you really know what those bugs are doing, like that's just, you don't. And it's just the state of the science where they are. I'm not a microbiota expert. I do happen to know people who are, and I absolutely trust, what they know about the research and what they've shown me. And that's just right. You have to, the most important part of any scientific endeavor is acknowledging the limitations and, to the degree that we can, the known unknowns. And all of the things I just mentioned right now really are unknown.
Yeah, there seem to be several papers about Akkermansia muciniphila, which I wanted to ask you about, which suggests that they have, so just the presence of them doesn't really, like you said, it doesn't tell you whether it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, because Akkermansia can feed on prebiotic fiber, but from my understanding, it can also start to feed on the mucus layer itself. So can you explain the importance, first of all, of the gut mucus layer? And then if fiber is really required to feed that Akkermansia?
Yeah. So the short answer to your question is, I don't know, because I don't think, and not because I don't know, I think it's because it is not known.
Right.
And so right, the importance of the mucus, right? So any of these tissues that we have exposed to the outside environment that are not the skin, although actually, I mean, the gut is a continuation of the skin. You're like an inside out tube, right? It's sort of like, it just continues from the outside and inside and all the way around. But so like the eyes and the mouth and the genital tract and the gut, you need some mucus to protect against the outside environment. That's the simplest way to think of it. Mucus is incredibly important. And so in the gut, it helps sort of maintain that lining and a barrier of protection against the outside world. So like stuff that is inside your gut is technically the outside world compared to the body. But they've done some studies where if you have mice that are sort of humanized from their gut microbiota, you call them gnotobiotic mice. So they're mice, but they have more of a human type microbiota. Particularly, and then when you do that, you have to like just use specific strains, because you can't perfectly mimic the human microbiota, because like you said, any two people will only have about a third of an overlap of their gut microbiota, and any two healthy people may have no overlap whatsoever, right? This kind of brings us to the point where it says that I can't tell you what a healthy gut microbiota is. That's sort of like one of the points they make in the paper. But anyway, so like some studies where if you go on a low fiber or a low carb diet, they think they show that the Akkermansia then starts to eat into the mucus lining, which if the mucus is good, then that might be detrimental, because you're removing some of that protective barrier. There are other studies in similar models that haven't shown that, and you don't really see that in humans necessarily, who go on lower fiber or more animal based diets. So when you pick a very specific model in animals, then you might see some of these shifts. But how that actually relates to humans, we don't know. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is more Akkermansia important for you to benefit from your ketogenic diet? Is less? Like I said, I have examples of both. And so, yes, we know it's an important component of the gut microbiota. We know that it responds to diet, but how it responds to diet is very difficult to predict. And we also don't know whether it's uniformly good, uniformly bad. Its presence doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? So if you imagine, right, if you put humans into a given environment, I could, live as part of the land, be very careful about my footprint, just take what I need and replenish and be restorative and regenerative. Or I could strip mine that whole thing, start burning fossil fuels, destroy the environment, right? But I'm still a human, right? I am exactly the same species. And I think that you have to think about the gut microbiota the same way. Like, just knowing the species doesn't know anything about its function, how it's interacting with the environment, how it's sort of supporting or being for or against gut health. Like, we still just don't know that yet.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because in the paper you also mentioned something that I didn't know. Bifidobacteria, which is, something that I think is touted as being very beneficial in all cases sometimes, isn't found in the Hadza population. And they're really healthy, right?
Yeah, and so right, there's two sides of this. One is that we could say, well, hey, there's no bifidobacteria in the Hadza, and the Hadza are super healthy, therefore bifidobacteria are bad, or we don't need them, right? Or in an alternative setting, right, in adult humans, in the Western food environment, we do think those who have more Bifidobacteria are generally healthier. And, that's a bidirectional thing. And so, right, then we would say, well, all, Bifidobacteria are super important. We want to increase that, in the population we're working with, which is people in the Western environment. So, but like, who knows? Like in some scenarios, yes, they're potentially good. They are butyrate producers, right? We think that's going to support, right? They break down fiber, and that's going to produce, metabolites that our gut epithelial cells are going to like. But in some populations that are healthy, they don't have them. And so there's a big problem when we say that this is or isn't required for gut health. Just like we say, right, this, so they use that like hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza to say, you see how much fiber these guys eat? You should eat that much fiber. And well, there's two sides of that. One is that you probably wouldn't, because of the environment that you've been in, or your ancestors have been in for the last however many hundreds or thousands of years, you probably couldn't tolerate a lot of that same dietary approach. But equally, a lot of the fiber that they had to eat, they then spit out because they just like chew it up. They don't swallow it, and so like the amount that's going into their mouths is not necessarily the amount that ends up in their guts.
Right.
So as ever, it's a much more complex story than we're usually told.
Yeah, absolutely. In the paper, you actually mentioned 4 possible concerns with low carbohydrate and animal-based diets. I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them, but I want to attempt to maybe highlight the most important takeaways. You mentioned hydrogen sulfide, lipopolysaccharides, TMAO, and bile acids. Could you start with hydrogen sulfide?
Yes. So hydrogen sulfide is what we might call a gasotransmitter. So it's an important molecule for regulating metabolism, and so and gases that do that. So like CO2, nitric oxide, oxygen, hydrogen sulfide, they're, in this sort of gasotransmitter group. And some amounts are produced in normal healthy metabolism, and it's an active signaling molecule. However, there are certain subsets of gut pathologies associated with an overabundance of bacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide. So what is sometimes called hydrogen sulfide dominant SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And those bacteria that produce a lot of hydrogen sulfide really love high fat, high protein diets. So the one scenario where you might want to avoid that kind of diet is in that scenario, right? So if somebody has a lot of hydrogen sulfide producers, then maybe a lower fat, higher fiber diet is a better approach. And certainly, so practitioners have been doing that and seeing benefit there. So that's like one potential downside. The other thing, which I've had to change my mind on over the years, is the LPS, the lipopolysaccharide. And I used to be very worried about that in a certain subset of ketogenic dieters, and which is still possible. But basically, lipopolysaccharides are what we call endotoxins. They sit inside the bacterial cell wall, and they are transported across the gut, in particular with fat, into chylomicrons. And so I certainly have had a subset of clients and athletes who would go on a ketogenic diet, and like they'd slam a big bulletproof coffee, and like all of a sudden they just like feel super brain foggy and they wouldn't feel very good. And my theory was that this was a load of lipopolysaccharide just like coming across the gut wall. However, not all LPSs are bad. In fact, the majority are maybe useful. Like they help tell the immune system, hey, this is what's in the gut. This is what to expect. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So they can be immunomodulatory rather than inflammatory. Okay. And then also it's probably safer to absorb LPS as part of that fat absorption system, because then that shuttles it to the liver where it gets basically broken down and metabolized, gets removed, rather than say if you had a damaged gut lining, and this stuff is just coming across, in an unregulated manner. So as long as your gut is functioning normally, this is probably not a bad thing. But if you have, some gut pathology, it's possible that it's still problematic. But alongside that, kind of like I mentioned earlier, and this is another point that's sort of made towards the end of the paper, is that if you have significant gut inflammation, so if you say you have inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis, or something like that, you may not be as good at utilizing the butyrate that your gut bacteria produce. So you may instead benefit from ketones coming from the circulation. So then in that scenario, maybe a ketogenic diet is beneficial because you can actually better support the metabolism of your gut sort of cells. So that's an option too. So again,
Interesting.
It's complicated, but depending on the person in front of you, and gut pathology is very common, and so even somebody with the same symptoms may have very different things going on, and so then different dietary strategies are potentially going to be useful in those different scenarios.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So with the in the case of lipopolysaccharides, if you have something like leaky gut intestinal permeability, that could be potentially problematic.
Yeah, and it seems to be potentially bidirectional. So if you look at people who have insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, the worse that disease and the more symptoms or diagnostic criteria they have of metabolic syndrome, which includes high blood pressure, high triglycerides, high blood sugar, low HDL cholesterol, the more of those you have, the more circulating endotoxin you see in those people. So it could be, it's probably a bit of both directions, right? So if you have worse metabolic health, you have worse gut health, more of these endotoxins are making their way into the circulation. And then once they're there, they can create an inflammatory response that then maybe worsens metabolic health. So there's kind of like a bit of a feed forward effect there. So yes. And this is what some people call metabolic endotoxemia, like an association between the amount of endotoxin you have circulating and your metabolic health. Like what's chicken and what's egg, difficult to tell, but there's probably some interaction there. But anything that improves metabolic health automatically improves gut health, which then also reduces endotoxemia. So like if you have type 2 diabetes, you may have a lot of endotoxin. You may go on a ketogenic high-fat diet, and even though that's potentially bringing more endotoxin across, at the same time, you're improving metabolic health for a whole load of other reasons, which is going to improve gut health, which then is going to reduce your LPS load. So even though some of those things seem potentially contradictory, if wherever you can make some headway in terms of improving health, that will automatically improve everything else.
So yeah, that's a common theme that I think I've been saying since I started this podcast, and I wanted to get guests who share that because I think it's so true that if you fix one thing, it's likely that it's probably going to fix a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah, and both like from a physiological standpoint, but also we know that as humans, if we start to do more things that support our health, we will have more motivation and commitment to do other things, right? So we know that people who quit smoking are more likely to exercise, or people who do more exercise are more likely to quit smoking, or people who do more exercise are more likely to improve the quality of their diet, or the quality of their sleep. So like just saying that it was this one thing that fixed it isn't necessarily true, because all those other things then start to come with it.
Could you touch on quickly TMAO and bile acids?
Yeah, so TMAO is this breakdown product from carnitine. So again, largely found in animal foods, and it's associated with cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure, maybe insulin resistance. And it's really the problem is that it's really complicated. So they have shown that your gut microbiota determines whether your TMAO goes up or down in response to a certain meal. Sorry, TMAO is not choline is the important precursor for TMAO. So it partly depends on the gut microbiota, and it also partly depends on the form that it comes in, right? So I think there was a recent study where they gave people like whole eggs versus isolated choline as a supplement. And the eggs, despite it being the same amount of choline, the eggs didn't cause an increase in TMAO, but the isolated choline did. So like, it's not just the nutrient, it's the context it comes in. And so like in general, if you're looking at red meat or animal-based foods, we think we see more TMAO after a meal, and that's in animal models, more TMAO is associated with cardiovascular disease, obesity, insulin resistance. However, you also get big fat spikes in TMAO after eating certain types of seafood, and we also think that seafood in general is protective for cardiovascular disease. So there's a mixed picture there. There's also been some recent Mendelian randomization studies that suggest TMAO is basically just along for the ride, and it's insulin resistance that increases TMAO, and then insulin resistance causes cardiovascular disease, and then TMAO and cardiovascular disease look linked when actually it's insulin resistance that's the common factor. There are some, so I actually got at least one email after the paper came out where somebody sent me like, well, here are all these other reasons why TMAO may still be bad. I'm not like saying that that we know the answer. And actually a lot of the paper is not us saying, hey, we don't know the answer. It's us saying, hey, we really don't know the answer, because actually there's here stuff on both sides. So don't say that this stuff is inherently bad when actually here's some stuff that says that that's not the case. That was kind of the goal of a lot of the paper.
Right.
And we also know, finally, that in people who eat more animal-based diets, potentially they are better at metabolizing and breaking down TMAO so that it's not problematic. So then it kind of, again, depends on what was the dietary context before that food came into your gut in the first place. So A, we don't necessarily know the link between TMAO and disease outcomes, and B, it's going to be highly dependent on how the precursors arrive and your gut health and physical health, before then. So it's just not as simple as saying this is good or bad.
Yeah, again, I think that's a major theme of this episode. Yeah. It's right, adaptability, and do what works for you, because it likely isn't what works for your friend, your sister, your brother, your mom, or your dad.
Yeah, and it's and so, like, we haven't really touched a lot on bile acids, but essentially the storyline is the same, right? Some people will say, right, eating more fat results in release of more bile acids. There's a storyline that it has a negative effect on the gut, but actually there's lots of evidence to suggest that actually bile acids can have beneficial effects on the gut and on gut health. And again, I think this is part of the flexibility of the gut, right? As soon as if you dramatically change the food that's going in, you're going to get a shift in the microbiota. You're going to get a shift in the production of different metabolites, like whether it's short chain fatty acids versus iso short chain fatty acids, or you're producing ketones in the body, or more bile acids come in because it's higher fat. And all of this is just the microbiota and the gut metabolism shifting to accommodate this new diet. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. We just think it's bad because it's a shift from what's happening in the average, quote unquote, healthy person. Like we kind of said, in general, it's very much a case of what works for one person isn't going to work for somebody else. And I know that that's frustrating, right? We want to know that we have the answers, but at least for me, I think it's more interesting, right? If we actually had the answers, we wouldn't. There's a famous quote from Albert Einstein, which is, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research. And that basically sort of informs a lot of how I work with stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely the case. I think, like we've said, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but it tends to never be black or white. But within that, I did want to ask you, what are some of the things that seem to be more definitive in terms of improving your gut health and improving your metabolic health?
Yeah. So kind of just to quickly step outside of the dietary stuff, so diet is one, and we can come back to it. But I think there are 5 critical things that essentially support overall human health, and they are diet, sleep and circadian rhythm, movement, stress mitigation, be that mindfulness, meditation, yoga, prayer, any of those, and then social connection. And then obviously stress reduction and social connection can be intertwined, because the things that you do socially, can help to mitigate stress. But like, those are the things, the critical components of pretty much every kind of corner of alternative health, be it integrative medicine, functional medicine, lifestyle medicine. All of those things, even though they all pretend to be different, the reasons why they're not, in my mind, and why they're all generally often very successful, is because they focus on those 5 things. Diet then becomes one of the things that is done differently across those different groups. So lifestyle medicine seems to be, unfortunately, sort of nailed onto a low-fat plant-based diet, and that's especially in the US. They're like, if you do lifestyle medicine, it's got to come with a low-fat plant-based diet,
Right.
Which I don't think is true, and there are others who agree with that. But the important thing from a dietary standpoint, both from metabolic health, gut health, is just improve the quality of your diet, right? If you move from a highly refined, ultra-processed Western diet that's full of refined starches, refined sugars, refined oils, and you move it to a diet that includes whole foods, that look a lot more like the food was on the plant or on the animal, and that can be, you can include everything: eggs, dairy, meat, fish, vegetables, legumes, all of those things, grains, all of that comes under there, as long as you've improved the quality of the diet overall. And so again, what seems to tie together success in ketogenic diets, paleo diets, the DASH diet, Mediterranean diet, the plant-based diets, is in all of those where you see sustained success, you've improved the quality of the diet, right, and you've moved towards more whole foods, for want of a better word. So that, I think, is critical, and that's what explains most of the benefit, across the dietary spectrum.
Yeah, amazing. Now, where can people find out more about you and your work?
So I probably post most frequently on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Tommy Wood. I don't post that frequently though. Like if something, an interesting study or something I'm thinking about comes up, you'll get a post. Sometimes it's just me posting pictures of my dogs or me in the gym in my stories. But I do try and answer every DM that I get. So if you have a burning question, please feel free to find me there. I do have a website which hasn't been updated in a long time, but you'll find like my CV and all my publications and stuff like that. It's drragnar.com, drragnar.com. And so yeah, if you're more interested in like my academic work and all that stuff, then head there. But my more recent papers that are sort of generally related to human health, like this one on the gut microbiota, that will also end up on Instagram, so you'll see updates there.
Great, and I'll have links to those in the description and in the show notes. Now, to finish off, I usually do a couple of rapid fire questions. So first of all, what is the most important habit that you personally do every day to support your health?
Coffee first thing? No. I move every day. Like it's a non-negotiable for me.
And what advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
Girls don't care if you have a six-pack. In general, or girls that do aren't girls that you want to be trying to chase down anyway.
There you go. Awesome. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on the show. This was incredibly valuable. I learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks. Real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.